Disclaimer: content in this video has been created strictly for educational and investigational purposes. There is no intention to glamorise or endorse criminality or any aspect of crime. The information in this video has been acquired online from publicly available sources. Barlinnie was designed by Major General Thomas Bernard Collins, architect and engineer to the Scottish Prison Department. Built in the northeast of Glasgow and Ridley, the grounds were bought in 1879 and construction started in 1880. The first prisoners would arrive in A Hall on the 15th of August 1882. At this stage, A Hall was the only cell block that was built. So, in order to keep construction costs down, prisoners for A Hall were used as labourers to help build B, C and D Hall, which were constructed between 1883 and 1892. Then in 1896, the infamous E Hall would be added to help with, can you guess it, overcrowding. Barlinnie adopted Perth's model of prisoner separation based on age, gender and severity of crime. Plus it took advantage of the larger prison population by introducing manual labour that would accommodate larger groups of prisoners. This would take the form of prison construction, as I mentioned previously, but also beating rocks for the local quarry. Just battering boulders all day. As much as Barlinnie had made advances in attempting to rehabilitate prisoners by introducing constructive work programmes, its punitive measures were still very much in the dark ages. For instance, a common punishment back then for unruly behaviour was to get wrapped up in a straitjacket and your horns cuffed behind your back overnight. Depending on the severity of your punishment, it could extend to more than one night, right? But of course, the prison did take precautions. They would assess if the con was fit for this punishment by the prison, and the warden would put on the cuffs and the jacket. And there was me thinking that all humanity was lost. At least they had the decency to make sure you could hack it before they grabbed the jacket. Come on, somebody's got to be laughing. But funnily enough, it would be a jacket and exploitation of prisoner labour that would land Barlinnie in one of its many controversies in 1943, when a prisoner called Leonard Wilson and 4 other cons were given unsupervised painting work in the Governor's House. Let me explain this. See, back in the Governor's House would be very similar to a janitor's house in a school. This would be the acting governor's personal residence, located just in or about the prison grounds. This was during a time where there was no such thing as instant communication like phones or radios, so the governor had to be reachable in case of emergencies. Leonard Wilson was a 23-year-old former soldier for London who was serving a sentence for a housebreaking. It decided to seize the opportunity whilst being in the governor's house to swipe a jacket, a pair of trousers and a watch. And listen, his plan wasn't to take them back up the hall and swap it for a bit of spice. You know what I'm talking about? These were much simpler times. And Leonard Wilson's plan was to get the boot down. Pulling on the governor's favourite clobber, Leonard Wilson walked off and nobody batted an eyelid. But the thing is, the governor's clays must have been a bit too wee for him, because the next day he broke into a house in St George's Road in Glasgow and robbed a full wardrobe. Apparently he found a boyfriend. His freedom would be short-lived when an off-duty copper spotted him in a tramcar, recognising him for the mugshots since he was wanted, and jailed him. In court, Wilson would receive an extra 3 month imprisonment. A ballsy escape indeed, but it had not known what would be Barlinnie's first major jailbreak in 1980, when Johnny Boy Steele, his brother Jim, and a man called Archie escaped in a very audacious fashion. Johnny Boy and Jim were classed as high-risk prisoners due to a previous jail escape in another jail, so they were unable to be housed in the top landing in case they escaped, or the bottom landing in case they tunnelled out. So they both stayed in the second landing, whilst Archie was on the third. But what Johnny discovered was a 12-inch wide shaft filled with pipes that linked to the top flare. So using this shaft, Johnny Boy and Jim managed to climb to the third flare to join Archie. And from there, they managed to access a space between the ceiling and the roof, where the metal gate had already been partially cut by another con using a smuggled hacksaw. The 3 of them climbed until eventually reaching a door which led onto the roof. From there, they were able to see a number of accomplices that were also on the other side of the prison wall who were waiting to aid them in their escape. The accomplices went into the staff quarters garden and tied one end of the mountaineering rope to a washing line pole. Johnny Boy threw down a reel of tape he stole from the textile workshop, and the rope was attached to it so he could pull it back and tie it in the other end. With the rope now set in place at both ends, the trio abseiled down to the walls of the prison into the back of a getaway vehicle where they made their escape. But unfortunately for the boys, they were caught within a few weeks and returned to the jail. Side note, if you want to hear the story of the jailbreak along with many other prison escape stories, then check out my podcast with the man himself, Johnny Boy Steele, only on Premeditated Patter. But back to the episode. There was also another occasion in 1985 when a man called John Dobby, 3 days into a 15-year sentence, would hide inside a laundry van and escape from Barlinnie. He was on the run for 5 days before being eventually caught and then sentenced to another 5 years in jail. You can't help but notice there was a pattern emerging here, right? What was causing prisoners to try and escape in the 1980s? Was it the inability to deal with the loss of freedom? Were they choking for their hole? Or was it the grub? You see, it might have been all of these things. It might have been all of these factors. But one of the biggest issues during that period in time was prison violence. And not just con-on-con action. This was brutality at the hands of the screws. In one incident in particular, where convicted robber Sammy the Bear Ralston was allegedly beaten by the wardens with sticks whilst he'd been gagged to muffle his screams. For the cons in B-Hall, this was a step too far. A decision that would spark the most infamous rebellion Barlinnie had seen to date. And that was the 1987 Barlinnie riots. On January 5th, 1987, around 7:30 PM in B-Hall, a number of cons got tooled up with makeshift weapons and wore pillowcases as balaclavas. They overpowered the screws. Lockers, beds and debris were flung for the landings to the Bolton flat. Fires were lit and the cons took control. There was roughly 41 screws in the hall when the riot broke out, but most of them managed to get away. But 5 of them would barricade themselves inside a cell in the third flat trying to escape for the carnage. Although this was a decision that would be a massive mistake. You see, it wouldn't take long before the cons realised the screws were in the cells, eventually gaining access and capturing them. Of the 5 screws, 2 would be released and 3 were taken hostage. It was only a matter of time before the cons would gain access to the roof, where they would start throwing concrete slabs and tiles onto the street below. By this point, the SPS had declared the riot a major prison disturbance, which called for assistance for the SPS and the police. Within a few hours, it was declared a major prison disturbance, mobilising resources for the Scottish Prison Service and local authorities. Senior officials, including Governor Andrew Gallagher, coordinated with law enforcement to assess the situation and strategise a response. With B-Hall being under the cons' command, they would eventually get access to the roof, where they appeared and started ripping slates for the roof and launching them onto the street below, causing it. January 5th, 1987, the night Barlinnie turned into a war zone. It's just after 7:30 in B-Hall, the kind of time folks should be settling down. But no, not in the Big Hoose. Inside there was, a storm was brewing. A squad of cons, face covered in pillowcases like makeshift balaclavas, got tooled up with sharpened metal, chair legs, and anything else they could get their hands on. This wasn't just mayhem, it was mutiny. Beds and lockers hurled off landings, missiles, fires flickering up, and the very bones of the prison shook. Screws ran for their lives. Most of them escaped, but no all. 5 screws found themselves trapped and barricaded in a cell on the third landing, trying to hide from the madness. But that move was a colossal mistake. The cons clocked it quickly. They kicked in the door, 2 screws got released, but other 3 get kept as hostages. And then it escalated. The cons smashed their way into the roof. They started launching slates and concrete slabs down to the street below. The SPS went into full panic. The riot was declared a major disturbance. Backup drafted in from across the country. Governor Andrew Gallagher tried to hold it together and coordinate with the police. But B-Hall wasn't his anymore. It was the cons. And this is a bit people forget. This wasn't the first time. You see, back in 1986, just months before, 40 cons had staged another siege. This one lasted 4 days and ended in flames, causing £500,000 in damage. That time, a screw got taken hostage as well. John Renton for the Prisoners Association blamed overcrowding and understaffing, but the politicians denied it. Malcolm Rifkind, the State Secretary at the time, brushed it off, said only 50 out of 5,000 prisoners were involved, as if that meant it wasn't serious. Ian Lang, Home Affairs Minister, came out spinning He claimed Barlinnie wasn't overcrowded and rehabilitation was the focus. But you ask any con in that cage what they were getting, and they'll tell you slop buckets, cracked walls, brutality, and broken promises. Eventually, after 18 hours of siege, the riot fizzled out. The turning point, negotiators managed to talk the remaining cons down. Promises were dangled, and slowly the hostages were released, battered but alive. The last of the rooftop warriors surrendered at dawn. No bullets, no SAS, just exhaustion, cold, and no way out. And just like that, the dust settled. But the cracks were shown. You see, this riot wasn't just about one grievance. It was a scream against a system that had been creaking for decades. Overcrowded cells, overstretched staff, and no real focus on rehabilitation. Just containment. And aye, Barlinnie did come back under control, but the system was still teetering. Barlinnie saw its host with problematic prisoners, but there was always that 1% that the system itself couldn't handle, spread throughout the jail system, wreaking carnage wherever they went. But it was in the 1970s where a revolutionary idea would become one of the most progressive measures in the Scottish prison system to this date, and that idea was the special unit. So it's the early 1970s, right? The Scottish prison system was bursting at the seams with violence. Prisoners slashing each other, screws getting attacked left, right and centre. It was just chaos, right? The traditional punishments like battering cons into submission just made things worse, surprisingly. So the SPS realised something needed to change sharpish. They looked down south to England, to a place called HMP Grendon. You see, Grendon wasn't your normal nick. It was based on this mad idea called a therapeutic community, basically meaning prisoners and guards work together to deal with the root causes of violence instead of just punishing the surface behaviour. Initially, they planned to build this unit in Perth, but logistics meant it ended up in Glasgow's infamous Barlinnie in 1973, in an old block that used to house female prisoners. And that was it. The special unit was born. Now, the special unit wasn't your usual prison setup. Here's the deal, right? Cons were treated as actual human beings. Mental, right? They go to wear their own clobber, no prison garb. There was no shouting matches or batterings for screws. Instead, cons and screws talked things out. They made decisions together. Respect was earned and given both ways. And here's where it get really interesting, right? The inmates got to explore their creativity. These are guys that are previously known for stabbing and slashing, were now picking up paintbrushes and chisels. An art therapist called Joyce Lang, a legendary woman, got involved and helped inmates channel their rage and pain into art and writing. One famous inmate, you might have heard of him, Jimmy Boyle, was one of the hardest guys in Scotland, but he went from being a notorious gangster to a successful artist and writer. Jimmy Boyle was the poster boy for what the special unit could do. And right, before we go any further, right, let's get a wee bit of background on Jimmy Boyle, because you can't really talk about the special unit without giving him a mention. See, Jimmy Boyle wasn't just some petty criminal, right? He was known across Glasgow as one of Scotland's most dangerous criminals. Born and raised in the Gorbals, he grew up in a world of poverty and violence. But in the 1960s, he was a leading figure in Glasgow's underworld, infamous for his ruthless violence and gang involvement. Boyle was eventually sentenced to life imprisonment for murder in 1967. But even behind bars, he was a nightmare to manage. He fought guards, stabbed fellow prisoners, started riots, and spent long periods in solitary confinement. He was considered one of Scotland's most violent and disruptive inmates, somebody the system just couldn't handle. Eventually, Boyle was transferred to the newly opened special unit in Barlinnie in 1973, in what was basically a desperate attempt to manage him. And incredibly, this was the turning point for Boyle. Introduced to art therapy, he channeled his aggression into creativity, becoming an accomplished sculptor and writer. His autobiography, A Sense of Freedom, even inspired a famous film starring Scottish actor David Heyman, which showed the power of rehabilitation firsthand. But listen, we can't deny it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows, right? Ere its 21 years operating, there was 11 serious incidents. But here's the thing, right? Only 2 were actual assaults. Most of them were just guys barricading themselves in the cell when emotions got too much. But you think about that, right? Some of Scotland's most dangerous men and only 2 assaults in their 20 year. And listen, the 2 assaults were serious, but isolated. In one of the incidents, a con attacked another con during a dispute, resulting in injuries but no fatalities. The second assault was between a con and a screw essentially. Again, it was serious, but it's quickly resolved without further escalation. What's important to highlight here, right, is these incidents of violence were exceptions rather than the norm. Far fewer than standard prison halls at the time. And the unit wasn't just effective at stopping violence inside, right? It was actually helping these guys stay out of trouble when they got out. You see, of the 36 guys that went through the special unit, only 4 get reconvicted. That is mental, considering the history of violence these guys had. Like pure unheard of success. But we can't talk about incidents in the special unit without discussing one of its most notorious events, which was the death of Larry Winters. Winters was another high-profile inmate sentenced to life imprisonment in 1964 for murder. Like Jimmy Boyle, Winters was violent and unmanageable in regular jails, and he eventually ended up in a special unit and all. Larry Winters was a complicated figure, intelligent but tormented. He struggled with drug dependency and mental health issues. But inside the special unit, he began to show progress, engaging with therapy, poetry and creative writing. But unfortunately, his struggles with drugs never completely went away. In September 1977, Larry Winters died of a drug overdose inside the special unit. His death was a massive scandal at the time. Media jumped all at it, claiming it was proof that the special unit wasn't working. His life was actually so impactful, it actually inspired a Scottish film called Silent Scream, which looked at Winters' tragic journey and questioned the prison system itself. Winters' death highlighted both the promise and the harsh realities of the therapeutic approach. It was groundbreaking, but no perfect. As you can imagine, not everybody was happy with all this. Some people in the public were raging. They thought it was soft. These guys are violent criminals. What you playing it, giving them art lessons? Papers like the Daily Record loved stirring it up to sell copies. Every time something minor went down, they splashed it across the front pages, shouting about scandal. Politicians were split. Some thought it was a progressive approach to rehabilitation. Others saw it as a total waste of taxpayers' money. Bit of a cheat to talk, if you ask me. Airtime pressure mounted and the political mood shifted back to being tough on crime. Things weren't looking good for the special unit. In 1994, after 21 years, the special unit shut down for good. Why? It was expensive to run, staff intensive, and politicians and public opinion swung back to a more traditional approach to punishment. The authorities started to lose faith, no matter how well it worked. In the end, the revolutionary idea of treating criminals as human beings was considered too controversial, too radical, and frankly, too expensive. So here's a £1,000,000 question, right? Did it work? You could argue both ways, right? The special unit drastically reduced violence and recidivism among Scotland's most dangerous prisoners. But society just wasn't ready for it. David Wilson, a leading criminologist, described it brilliantly, right? He called it a quote-unquote failed success. It proved rehabilitation could work, but the system itself wasn't ready for it. The unit's closure left a bitter taste, and it took the Scottish prison system back to square one. Punishment first, rehabilitation second. To this day, there's not been another like it in Scotland. But the special unit's short existence proved one thing clearly. If you give people respect, compassion, and opportunities to change, many actually will. After the special unit was closed, Barlinnie was still operating under conditions that weren't exactly up to scratch. Reports started to pile up, criticising the place for being insanitary and outdated. I know you probably remember hearing about the grim practice of slot moot, where cons had to use buckets as toilets in their cell. It actually took until the late 90s to properly address this. And between 1997 and 2004, Barlinnie went through some serious renovations. Finally, they get toilets installed in cells, improving human rights conditions massively, at least on paper. But did this solve all the problems? No, really. Even after these improvements, Barlinnie was still bursting at the seams. Built to hold around 1,000 prisoners, Barlinnie usually holds about 1,400 cons, right? Running constantly at about 140% of its capacity. Overcrowding meant rehabilitation programmes suffered, conditions deteriorated again, and violence was always just under the surface. It became obvious to everybody that simply renovating wasn't enough. Barlinnie was struggling to cope. Eventually the Scottish Government realised there wasn't much more they could do with the building. In January 2020, they announced plans to build a completely new facility called HMP Glasgow. It meant to replace the ageing Barlinnie entirely. They picked the former site of gasworks in Provan Mill in the northeast of the city for this massive new super jail. It's supposed to be a state-of-the-art facility that could hold up to 1,344 cons and improve much improved conditions. But here's the thing. As of now, the new HMP Glasgow has been bogged down in delays and skyrocketing costs. What started out as a £100 million project is ballooned to nearly £1 billion, and completion is not expected until at least 2028. That's nearly a decade after it was announced. It just goes to show that even with good intentions, the system is still fraught with complications and delays. And an interesting twist for all this, right? Recently there's been moves to recognise the historical importance of Barlinnie itself. Historic Environment Scotland launched a consultation in October 2024 proposing to give the prison category A-listed status, meaning it would be preserved for historical and architectural reasons. So imagine that, right? A building that's been a symbol of punishment and incarceration for over 100 years being protected as a historical monument. It just shows you the complicated legacy behind places like Barlinnie. Places that symbolise hardship, violence, but also Scotland's unique social history. But Barlinnie isn't the only infamous jail in Scotland's history. There was also another establishment that made its mark and carved out a notorious reputation of its own. Known by some as Scotland's Alcatraz, located in the northeast, its brutal regime welcomes some of Scotland's most violent cons. Next up is HMP Peterhead. If you want to view this episode in its entirety, then head on over to the Patreon and sign up to the Patter Pro tier. For a small one-off payment, you can watch the full history of the Scottish Prison System podcast.